Dark Souls 2 is the most important game FromSoftware have ever released.
What did he say?
Now, I know that is quite the bold claim, and it's one that's taken me over 10 years to come to realize, so while everyone sharpens their pitchforks and gets ready to lynch me, let me explain. Now, I've recently done far too many playthroughs of Dark Souls 2 in the last couple of weeks. I've done about 4 in the latest patch version, going into New Game Plus cycles and running the DLCs, and then I downpatched the game all the way back to version 1.02, which is from April 2014, to experience what the PC release version was like before all the changes, the nerfs, the buffs, and the DLCs ever existed. You also might ask why? Why so much Dark Souls 2? Well, clearly I have nothing better to do with my life at the moment, but after 10 years I also wanted to get all the achievements done, and I did just that. The bloody Sunlight Medal grind was nearly the end of me. If you know, you know. But it did lead me down this lovely rabbit hole. Now, I first played DS2 in December 2014. Thank you, Steam, for remembering things that I can't even remember myself. DS2 was also my first step into the world of FromSoftware gaming. I always saw Demon Souls in stores, and I could never pick it up because I didn't have a PS3, and I was too busy with Need for Speed on my PS2 anyway. But Dark Souls was also released as a console exclusive, so I never played that either. They were both just on the shelves, mocking me for my lack of console ownership, and for mainly being a PC gamer. But that all changed with DS2 because it was coming to PC at release, well, a month after console release, but I digress. I was in college at the time, so I didn't pick it up immediately, mostly because I don't really remember much of that time anyway, for reasons. But the winter sale came in December and I grabbed it. Looking at my Steam achievements, I didn't beat the last giant until February, so I clearly wasn't immediately gripped by it, or I just needed to get good. I don't know. I can't remember. As usual, the game was very divisive, and now years later, having played FromSoftware's entire catalog, I can see why when it was released, it got the reputation that it did, despite receiving universal acclaim and commercial success. But there's also a more important side to it that general opinion seems to overlook. The best way to describe DS2 is experimental, and I highly respect FromSoftware for doing what they did with DS2, and it's actually something they do all the time. They don't just land on a popular IP and then release the same thing over and over again like a lot of developers do, because that's not innovation, that's stagnation. FromSoftware consistently releases brand new IPs to critical acclaim, and if you start to look into things, you can see DS2's influence in many ways in each of their titles that came afterwards. FromSoftware are generally known for their boss design, and they're the gold standard when it comes to having bosses that are tough but fair, and that's a very important thing because when you fail in their games, you generally know why. It's not that the game was unfair, you literally just messed up by getting greedy or not waiting long enough, whatever the reason, and I think DS2 played a massive role in that regard. Going a bit further back, you have Demon Souls, where generally the difficulty came from traversing the levels rather than the boss encounters themselves. Dark Souls was the opposite. The levels were easier to traverse and the boss encounters provided a bigger challenge. So when DS2 came along, they tried something new, and overall the boss design in DS2 is terrible. There's less than a handful of bosses in DS2 that are actually memorable and fun to fight, but that's actually fine. So let me explain. A lot of boss fights in DS2 are encounters that have more than one boss present or have a boss and multiple regular enemies present. Whenever it's a boss that's just by themselves, it's the same as Demon Souls or Dark Souls. For the most part, the boss is very simple and easy to deal with, especially if you compare them to modern day bosses from titles like Elden Ring. So I think to try and increase the difficulty for boss encounters in DS2, they went that route over and over again of having more than one boss in an encounter, but that is just a very arbitrary way of increasing the difficulty. It's the same as shooter games turning a boss into a bullet sponge to increase the difficulty. It's just bad design. What made it worse was that the boss encounters with more than one boss or with regular enemies present, they all aggroed to the player at the same time. There wasn't a proper give or take, it was just try and overwhelm the player by sheer numbers, and when you pair that with the clunky and limited movesets of the time, it didn't lead to a good experience. And I mean, the list goes on and on. The Belfry Gargoyles, Skeleton Lords, Executioner's Chariot, Royal Rat Vanguard and Authority, Prowling Mages, Duke's Deer Freya, Dragon Riders, Throne Watcher and Defender, Gang Squad in the DLC, Lurd and Zaylen, who also have the worst run back in FromSoftware history. A lot of bosses just didn't hit the mark. The reason why I said this is actually fine in hindsight is because FromSoftware learned from this. If they had just continued with the same boss design philosophy, it would have been a failure, but they didn't. They tried something new in DS2, didn't work, they learned from it, and improved. In all of their titles after DS2, yes, we have had the occasional dual boss fight, but they have been far, far better designed and way more scarce than being a central theme like they were in DS2. This is also, I think, what led them down the pathway of introducing two-phase boss fights as a way to do more with a boss and increase the difficulty while still being balanced and fair overall. The only two-phase fight really before was Ornstein and Smo in DS1, which, funnily enough, is the gold standard of doing a dual boss fight properly, but two-phase boss fights weren't really a thing. They only really started in their titles afterwards, and DS2 definitely played a big role in pushing them towards that. Not that it's got anything to do with DS2, but I think they're currently heading towards another problem with their boss design, because they've been making them faster and faster and giving them super long combos, which only allow players time to get in a single hit or heal and then back to dodging the next 1000 hit combo. There's not really much more room to push that further, and it's already leading to unenjoyable boss fights for many players, so it'll be interesting to see their next title's bosses and what they've done with them. But back to DS2, another big change that it brought about was how their games handle healing. In Demon Souls, you have the grass items, which you need to farm from enemies or purchase from merchants to be able to have heals for your character. Of course, there's always magic heals, but the primary way was grass items. Dark Souls changed things up by introducing the Estus Flask, a limited but refillable healing resource. You started with 5 and you could kindle the bonfires and increase that amount all the way up to 20. DS2 kept the Estus Flask mechanic from DS1, but they removed the Kindle mechanic, and instead you needed to find Estus Flask shards to upgrade your Estus Flask, giving you more uses out of it before it needed to be refilled. They also started you off with only 1 Estus Flask instead of the 5, and the system has followed through into their future titles. DS3, Sekiro, and Elden Ring all have the same limited but refillable healing flask that needs to be upgraded with specific items to get more uses out of it. They've never gone back to the DS1 system. Bloodborne is the outlier in that it went back to Demon Souls system with blood vials needing to be farmed or purchased from merchants if you wanted to have heals, which players did not really like. But it was a big change from DS1 to DS2, but it stuck around, and I'm sure it'll be the primary way going forward in any of their upcoming titles as well. In Demon Souls and Dark Souls, there was no way to undo levels on your character. Well, technically, Demon Souls, you could get sucked and it would remove a random level, but that wasn't a legitimate way or intended as a system. Once you had leveled up, that was it, which was problematic if you wanted to try a new weapon or build and didn't meet the stats to be able to use the weapon. And in games where there are a plethora of build options from melee to range to various magic schools, it kinda sucked having to have to restart all over just to try a different weapon potentially. DS2 solved this by introducing a proper respec system in the form of soul vessels, a consumable item that you could take to a certain NPC and you could reset all your levels and redistribute them. May seem small, but it was a massive change, and since then, other titles like DS3 and Elden Ring have had respec systems. Players still aren't too happy that it's tied to a limited consumable, but the fact is that it's there in the first place, and it's thanks to DS2. ADP, anyone? If you know, you know. One of the most hated aspects of DS2 was the ADP stat, an actual attribute that you had to invest in to get a better roll. Before, in Demon Souls and Dark Souls, it was just a standard roll system, and you had a different roll based on your equipment load, light, medium, and heavy. Simple to understand, standard across all builds, you didn't have to worry about it. But DS2 introduced ADP, which influenced your agility stat, which in turn influenced your iframes and how fast you used your consumables, like your flasks. So changing that up massively in DS2 was not exactly a good choice and just created a massive amount of confusion, especially for existing players who were expecting the same system as before, but hey, they tried and they never introduced it again. They've just gone back to the standard formula, which is a good thing. But DS2 did allow them that experimental test zone. You gotta look at the silver linings at least. ADP was hated by everyone, but power stancing was loved. DS2 introduced a proper dual-wield system for weapons, where if you use two weapons of a similar class, it allowed them to properly combo together, giving you more options in your builds and in your attacks. This just wasn't a thing before in DS1 or Demon's Souls. It made a return in DS3 with the paired weapon system, and then of course in Elden Ring, which expanded the dual-wield system massively, and it's all thanks to DS2. Armor in FromSoftware titles has always been more fashion over form, hence the Fashion Souls meme being born, but DS2 did change things up quite a bit when it came to armor. Before, you would have the occasional armor piece that gave you a specific benefit, like the pinwheel masks in DS1 or the Crown of Dusk, but there weren't a massive amount of armor pieces that did this. DS2 changed that, making armor not just a fashion choice, but a key aspect to your build and what you were trying to achieve at that moment. Increasing specific stats, item discovery, enhancing certain effects. There's a ton of armor pieces in DS2 that come with a particular bonus, and you can see this influence in the armor sets for later titles like Elden Ring. Even just the Jester set in DS2. The headpiece increases item discovery, the chest piece makes you immune to critical attacks, the legs reduce your fall damage, and the gauntlets increase the souls you get from kills. Each piece gives you something different, so they really went all in on the armor in DS2, and that just helped the design going forward in their future titles. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with Stone Sword keys in Elden Ring, specific keys that allow you to unlock access to certain areas or boss encounters. Well, long before Elden Ring, DS2 already did this with Pharos Lockstones, a specific key that allowed you to unlock hidden areas and loot, or a specific feature for an area that you were in, like the water pools in the Iron Keep, which could help with your survivability when crossing the lava and traps, or healing pools in Horsefuck Valley in the DLC, which I won't say anything more about because it deserves nothing more than the depths of hell. But the point is that DS2 introduced a different key system that didn't just involve standard doors, but was an extra alongside it for additional content that the player could explore and find. Now, you have Dark Souls 2, the Dark Souls 2 Season Pass, the 3 DLCs that you could buy individually, and Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin. Now, many games have many versions, that's nothing new, but the problem came with Scholar of the First Sin, because instead of it being the usual kind of Ultimate Edition that includes the game and all the DLC for it and the latest updates, etc., Scholar of the First Sin also changed up a lot of things in the game itself, adding new items, enemy placements, revamping the world, which meant it was very different to Dark Souls 2 Vanilla. It wasn't just a complete package, it was a new package, which meant that save files are not compatible between the two and you can't play with other players in the different version. Which means the player base was then split between the vanilla Dark Souls 2 and Scholar of the First Sin. That's not a good thing. You don't want some of your players in one version and the rest in another version. It just makes things a mess and creates confusion for new players. So while this isn't to say that the OG is better or Scholar of the First Sin is better, it did teach them to never repeat this mistake, because with Dark Souls, it was of course released on the 360 and PS3 and then eventually got its PC release, which was titled Dark Souls Prepare to Die Edition. But then years later, the remaster was announced and released, and they removed Prepare to Die Edition and eventually closed the online services for it. Why? Because they learned from the Dark Souls 2 episode. So yes, you can still play Prepare to Die Edition if you own it, but it's not available for purchase anymore anywhere, and it doesn't split the online player base either, because the only one that's for sale and has online features active is Dark Souls Remastered. So for new players, there's no confusion. Same with Demon's Souls Remake. Original Demon's Souls servers are closed. There's no split player base between the game versions. It's just the remake now. They've never done a Scholar of the First Sin thing again. Complete bundles, remasters, sure, but then there's only one version available. Also, something the remasters haven't done is change things to a degree like Scholar of the First Sin did, which wasn't super well received by the player base that had already gotten used to the DS2 Vanilla version, had already paid and bought DS2 Vanilla, and then a year later, Scholar came out. They've just been enhanced versions released much later, which have gone over much better with the player base, so it taught them a lot in that regard. There's also a couple things that DS2 did that we haven't really seen again, but definitely are really cool. Firstly, bonfire aesthetics. chuck it in the bonfire, and boom, that area is now NG+, without the need to go into NG+. That's really cool and useful. Whether you want to fight a particular boss again to learn it, to get the boss soul for a weapon, or just practice and get more souls, it's just a really interesting mechanic that hasn't been used again, but it definitely should. Same as the New Game Plus cycles in DS2 having additional enemy placements and loot. It just adds a bit of freshness to the different cycles, so it's not just the exact same thing over and over again, and helps and gives players a reason to replay through it again. It's nothing major, but just a nice little addition. DS2 also let you despawn enemies after you've killed them a certain amount of times, which is a really interesting design choice. Terrible if you're trying to farm the enemies, but useful if you just want one particular bugger gone from the game forever, although you could make them come back with the Covenant of Champions, but still, very interesting idea. And then there was even other little random things like the ability to jump off ladders, which wasn't a thing before DS2, and a death counter in Majula, so you can see the worldwide deaths of everyone. Dark Souls 2 tried a lot of different things and they just went for it, which I respect them for because most developers won't change the formula that works. They stagnate instead of innovate, but Dark Souls 2 had the balls to try it all, and you just gotta respect that. Didn't always nail it, but it tried. Anyway, let me know what you think of Dark Souls 2. If you enjoyed the video, then do me a small favor and seek lest that subscribe and like button. And I'll see you in the next one.